Hey everybody, it's Luca from Rackets and Runners. So, if you follow me on Instagram, you may have seen a little teaser story the other day of me not so secretly testing a racket. Yup, I've got the brand new blacked out Gravity Tour 98. Now this is going to be a slightly different type of video because I can't do a full review. I've only spent about 2 hours on court with it and I can't show you the final paint job. So this is going to be more of an initial impressions type of thing. I'll share what I can, but I'll obviously play test it a lot more in the next few months before it officially releases in January. And yes, a 98 square inch Gravity, you can probably guess just how ridiculously excited I was to get my hands on this thing. Now before I get into any details, let me remind you that any of the rackets we talk about on this channel you can check out on our website racketsandrunners.ca. Also, please remember to like the video, subscribe to the channel, follow me in the store on Instagram, and let me know in the comment section what you want me to cover next. I'm not gonna lie, when I heard this racket had come in, I sprinted to the store like a kid on Christmas morning, and it did not disappoint. I mean, look at this thing. This is one of the best pre-release paint jobs I've ever seen. Okay, maybe that is the Gravity glasses talking because yeah, it's just blacked out, which a lot of companies do, but still, subtle blue accents, half glossy, half matte. It definitely looks good. Now, what is the Gravity 98? Well, as you can probably guess, it's a 98 square inch version of the Gravity, and you can definitely tell that it's a Gravity. It has that signature teardrop shape. There are also some cap style grommets protecting the top of the hoop, which is interesting because we haven't really seen this on any racket other than the Prestige, at least from head. And they should do a good job of protecting this area from any potential scratching. Now let's talk a little more about the specs. Like the Tour 100 that I used for a very long time, it weighs 305 grams, and it also has a 22mm beam, not a 20mm beam like the Pro. Also, for those of you with keen observational skills, you may have noticed that the 22mm Gravities have a more modern design in the throat and the yoke than the Pro. This one is like those, so just slightly sharper lines throughout. I don't think this has any significant impact on performance, but it's always something I've wanted to mention because it is kind of weird that there's such a seemingly insignificant difference, so why would it be there? It probably just goes back to the fact that the Gravity Pro is just a rebranded mold of the original Speed from 2008, and that the 22mm Gravities were brand new molds in 2019, so they are a little bit more modern. But anyways, it's really not that important. Interestingly enough, this racket has a 16x19 string pattern. I was kind of hoping for an 18x20 or something a little bit denser because this is obviously a control racket, and as you may be able to tell on camera, it's actually quite an open 16x19. Even in the middle of the string bed where things generally get a little bit tighter on 16x19 control frames, it's still quite open, so spin is definitely a point of emphasis here, and from the little I've played with it, I have a sneaky suspicion this thing is going to eat strings up. Finishing up with the specs, and these are strung specs by the way, it has a 32.8 centimeter balance, a 321 swing weight, and quite a low 58 RA. Now, it feels soft, but not that soft, which is kind of weird. But anyways, now let's get into some playability. One of the main questions I had going into this was, will the Gravity magic transfer into a smaller head size? And yes, right off the bat, you can tell that this very much has that Gravity DNA. What makes all the Gravities stand out compared to so many other rackets is that they're very forgiving and stable, but they still have impressive control. In the case of the Gravity Pro, truly elite consistency and control. Now the Pro does have a thinner beam and an 18x20 string pattern, which is why it's a notch above the others in terms of control, and I will compare it to the 98 in a second. But the key element that makes all the Gravities forgiving and controlled is this teardrop shape, which just seems to have some magical stability to it. You feel it right away on the Gravity 98 Tour. It's not particularly heavy, and 321 is right around average for a control racket's swing weight, and yet the stability really is top notch. It held up extremely well both when I was countering pace and when I wanted to go big and generate my own. Of course, the big difference between this one and all the other Gravities is head size, and that you can also feel right away. Just for a second, pretend like the Pro doesn't exist because what I'm about to say doesn't really apply to it, but the Tour and the MP definitely have massive sweet spots, but they do sacrifice a little bit of precision to get that. The 98 Tour isn't quite as forgiving as those rackets, but it's also significantly more precise. And when I say precise, I mean that when you make contact in the sweet spot, you get a higher sensation of directional control. Especially compared to the MP, which is a racket I've tried really hard to like, but never felt fully confident swinging out with. This has a huge boost in terms of precision. The two string beds are almost identical in terms of density, but that smaller head eliminates most of the issues I have with stickiness on the MP. Stickiness, by the way, is when I feel like the ball kind of gets lost in the strings, which makes the launch more random. So the 98 is less forgiving and more precise, which is a pretty standard trade-off when you go smaller in head size. but that doesn't hold up quite as accurately when comparing it to the Pro. I've said this enough times now, but the Gravity Pro does seem to go against every conventional theory with tennis rackets in that its sweet spot shouldn't be as forgiving as it is considering how much precision and control it has. I did bring the original Auxetic Gravity Pro out for this playtest, and going back and forth between them, I did feel like, for one, the Gravity Pro sweet spot is a little bit bigger, and two, that racket is still a little bit more consistent. You have to remember, the Pro has a 20mm beam, an 18x20 string pattern with a very high static and swing weight, which means that other than the head size, it has every ingredient for control. Because it has a thicker beam and quite an open string pattern, the Gravity Tour 98 does still have somewhat of a launchy tendency that just doesn't exist on the Pro. With that said, those specs that make the Pro so good for control also make it quite demanding, especially its shape, head size, and weight, and it doesn't have quite as much variety as the Gravity 98, which we'll talk about later with power and spin. As much as I love the Gravity Pro, I've never been able to fully make the switch to it because I just don't have the technique and biomechanics to swing a racket like that if I end up needing to for more than 2 hours. This is where the 98 has a huge advantage. It's significantly quicker than the Gravity Pro, one, because it's lighter, but more importantly because that head size is smaller, which makes it feel much more maneuverable. The biggest downside to this unique teardrop design is that it tends to be a little sluggish because so much mass is concentrated up the frame. Compressing it into 98 square inches basically minimizes the negative effects of that shape, making it feel more standard. It's still not quite as quick as a racket with identical specs and a totally normal head shape, but it is way faster than the 100 square inch Gravities. I did also add a leather grip, as I usually do on these controlled 305 gram frames, and I don't think it was totally necessary because, like I said, the stability is so high, but I do like a leather grip on this racket. Adding weight to the handle obviously won't lower the swing weight, but it does make the balance more headlight, which I found nicely counteracted that high concentration of mass up the hoop, making it feel even more like a normal Control 98. Now let's talk about technology, because this racket and the rest of the Gravity line is going to have Auxetic 2.0, although it isn't actually branded anywhere on this racket right now. The main goal behind Auxetic 2.0 is to increase stability, which it does do pretty effectively, but one of the slightly disappointing side effects is that it is more muted than the original Auxetic. I do think this Tour 98 is a little muted. It's not bad, I don't want anyone to think that, but you definitely feel some of the technology in there. I do still want to spend a lot more time testing this before my full review, especially trying different strings, because I only tried it with Head Hawk Touch, so that may have played its part. But still, I do think it's more muted than the previous Gravities. The original Gravity Pro did have a more raw feel to it, just a little bit more feedback in general. That could also be the thinner beam, but I do have to say, there is still something addictive about the feel in here. When you catch the ball well, you get a little extra pushback from the frame, and it even makes a slightly different sound. It's got a really positive thwack to it that you don't get when you're not making good contact. I do like this because a lot of these stabilization technologies make the sweet spot huge and ambiguous in exchange for better stability, but this keeps a nice amount of definition in and out of it. Now let's go back to that variety I mentioned earlier. Power and spin are two characteristics that I've been quite complimentary about on the Gravities. They're certainly not power or spin rackets, but they are impressive at both of those considering their more control-oriented specs. The 98 pushes that even farther. Keep in mind, this racket has quite a thin constant beam, but thanks to this teardrop head shape, you get a little bit more leverage over the ball, which helps in both those departments. In terms of power, when you go for a big shot, that combination of stability and leverage work very well together to really launch the ball. There's absolutely nothing wimpy about it, which I was a little bit worried about with the smaller head size. Spin is actually even more impressive. Like I said, this has quite an open string pattern, so you can really dig into the ball, and you actually get really nice feedback when you hit a proper spin shot, which I wasn't expecting because there's not much in the way of spin tech here. The spin is so impressive that I'm actually not mad they went for a 16x19 string pattern here, because that puts it into a category of rackets I was not expecting to compare it to. This isn't just a pure control racket the way the specs and design might make it look on paper. It has a ton of variety. It's not quite comparable to frames like the Aero 98, Extreme Pro, and V-Core 98, but somewhere in between those and the Blade. Spin generation wouldn't be nearly as easy if it had 18 mains, so while it does have a small element of launchiness, you can control that launch if you play a modern spinny style, and that means this racket is extremely well-rounded. I do want to keep some of those more specific comparisons for the full review, but this is shaping up to be a great racket. Right now, the best way I can describe it is that it's kind of like a more subtle version of the 100 square inch Gravities, taking elements from each of them, but then toning down some of their pros and their cons. It has a big sweet spot, but it's just a little bit smaller than the 100s. It has great control, but a little bit less than the Gravity Pro, more than the MP though. It still has an element of sluggishness because of its shape, but much less than the 100 square inch Gravities. I think you get the gist. I also just quickly want to address the Head Boom Pro, which is the other 98 square inch 22mm head racket that has a unique head shape. They are kind of similar in that they're both impressively stable and have really solid power and spin considering how good they are for control, but they accomplish that in different ways. With the Boom, the squared shape at the top of the hoop concentrates a ton of mass up there and it gives it a very unique swing pattern. This is still unique, but just not as different as a lot of the other rackets in this category. Like I said, I'll get into way more detail in a few months, but for now, that is going to be the end of this video. There is a lot to be excited about. Thank you so much for watching, and remember that if you want to demo the Gravity Tour 98, well, you can't, at least not until January. Anyways, feel free to come visit us in store for anything tennis related, or you can check us out online at racketsandrunners.ca.